I'm Dominic Hopkinson, I'm a sculptor. I'm based in Leeds, and for the last 4 years I've been working on a project about Penrose tiling and aperiodic systems. And in April this year I was introduced to the mathematicians at the School of Maths here at Leeds University, and we're now in the process of writing an application for funding for me to do a year-long residency with a team working in aperiodic systems in 3 dimensions. I mean, I have to say my background in mathematics is extremely limited. I managed to scrape a grade C at O level many years ago. And it's an unusual trajectory to get to this point. I did a fine art degree in sculpture, and in my first year of that degree I read an interview with Benoit Mandelbrot. The only reason why I read it was because it was in an art magazine, and he was talking about his work in fractals, and the article showed photographs of the images, but it was more what he said. He talked about his own creative practice as a mathematician, using words and explaining it in a way that I could understand it as a wannabe artist, that his process was incredibly similar to an artistic process. And that kind of insight for me was what literally sort of pivoted my work straight into wanting to work with mathematics and science. So Mandelbrot's influence was predominantly that he did something about my understanding and appreciation of science and mathematics in a broad sense that I hadn't been given at school. So it was the realization that actually maths and all science is not about necessarily just the notation and the writing down of the sums and the equations. It's much more about the concepts and the big ideas. And I realized that they were all massively interesting, but also that they held so much information that as an artist and as a sculptor, that it was a sort of almost a bottomless pit of inspiration to make my work from. An aperiodic tiling system is a tiling system unlike virtually every other tiling system. So if we start with if you like, a standard bathroom tiling system made of square tiles, you can put 4 tiles in a square array, and then take those 4 tiles and then retile the whole bathroom using the same 4 tiles. Or if with wallpaper, it's the same pattern repeated, and you can match the patterns, and then you can make a large version of that pattern. With aperiodic tiling, it doesn't work like that. Aperiodic tiling is made up of only 2 tiles, and they're known as the fat rhombus and the thin rhombus. And they tile themselves in such a way that no large-scale structure repeats ever into infinity. There are areas of repeat pattern, but those repeat patterns are aperiodic as well, and by that means that there's no large-scale structure defining the dispersion of that pattern throughout the whole structure. They're found in nature in very rare instances of particular metal alloys, and they were discovered in 1986, I believe, by Dan Shechtman, who then went on to win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. They're known in that instance as quasi-crystals, and they were the first evidence that an aperiodic lattice at an atomic level exists. And so the way that the atoms are bonded at a crystalline structural level uses this 5-fold symmetry and this aperiodicity to build the lattice. And it's incredibly rare, and what the mathematicians are working on here at the university in Leeds is an attempt to engineer a polymer that expresses this same aperiodic structure at an atomic level. I was interested in the pattern at a 2-dimensional level as just reading them as sheets of information, and I do what I call kind of pattern recognition and frequency analysis on those structures. But also as a sculptor, I was fascinated in the idea of whether you were able to expand the 2-dimensional tile into 3 dimensions and then pack those blocks in 3-dimensional space to achieve the same effect. And it turns out that you can generate 2 blocks that represent the 2 different rhombic tiles in an aperiodic system, and then they fit together and generate ever increasingly large objects that express five-fold symmetry. In my work, I've shown the mathematicians two-dimensional structures that I have found within the tiling system that they weren't aware of. And that was interesting for me because I was surprised that the mathematicians weren't aware of the pattern there, and then have, through conversation, discovered that the mathematicians, particularly the ones that I'm working with at the moment, never think about them as a visual object. They always only think about it in terms of the mathematics of the tiling pattern. And so I don't understand the mathematics to any degree that they understand it at all. But what I do is, through experience, I can read the tiling system in such a way as to be able to define a very large amount of structure and information that I then colour the tiling system in to reveal. And it was one of these pieces of work that I showed Alistair Rutledge at the university, and his response was, "I didn't realise it did that." And it was a surprise to me to discover that I was able to show him something in a piece of his work, in effect, that he wasn't aware of. In terms of mirroring aperiodic structure in three-dimensional space, we're getting close to that. I've made an object which is a three-dimensional representation of a very small element of the two-dimensional system. I very proudly declared this at a talk that I gave at one of my exhibitions, and there was a mathematician in the audience, and she piped up and said, "Actually, what you've made there is not a three-dimensional representation of the two-dimensional plane. You've made a three-dimensional representation of a sixth-dimensional hyperspace," which was extremely exciting until I realised I had no idea what she was talking about. So the plan for part of the residency is to actually attempt to then convert this object into a material that allows us to shine light through it, so that we can project the shadow of the object onto a wall, and then see if by rotating that object we can move the shadow to create the effect of the sixth-dimensional hyperspace on a two-dimensional plane as the shadow.